Hey everyone, Angel Hicks here, founder of Evolve Women's Network, and you are in our literary circle this morning where we are going to be talking about Daring Greatly with Brene Brown. And if you know anything about Brene Brown or have seen her YouTube videos, Brene is all about vulnerability and shame, and she does all this research and has written dozens of books on what she has found. And so Daring Greatly is all about vulnerability. So it's really about having the courage to be vulnerable. So if any of you have been in a vulnerable state with someone or, married, like there's vulnerability that has to come with that, right? And vulnerability is really not weakness, it's really courage. And so she talks about tapping into that vulnerability to increase your courage and overcome some fear. So in a world where everyone wants to appear strong, confident, and like they know what they're doing, right? Being vulnerable really brings light to that we don't all know what we're doing. We just pretend like we do, right? Get vulnerable, drop the facade of perfection. So this book is one of her 3 New York Times bestsellers and explains how vulnerability is really at the core of all of our feelings. So not just bad ones like fear, anxiety, and shame, which is a lot of her research is around, but also the good ones like love, joy, and passion. Right? You can't get to those emotions without vulnerability. So she says that we could all use a little more vulnerability in our lives because it's neither good nor bad. It just is. And embracing that means you're courageous. So let's get into the top 3 things we're going to talk about today. 1, vulnerability means strength, not weakness. 2, understand and verbalize your shame to make it go away. And 3, children can only become who you are. So be a role model. And I think here the word children, of course, she is an adamant teacher of parenting skills, I'll say, but this really could go into your teams too, right? So the people that are following you can really not become who you are, but really follow you if you're being vulnerable, and they can follow that, and so that you're being a role model for them. So we'll talk about that too. She says, you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And I just love that quote. She says, embrace the suck, which is awesome. That's how she talks in her books. But I put the Power of Vulnerability TED Talk link here, and I'll also put it in the comments when I post this video. But it's a great video. It's 20 minutes, and she talks a lot, of course, again, about the research she's done and the work she's done. So I highly recommend taking a moment to check that out too. So lesson number 1, if you can be vulnerable, it means you're strong and not weak. And of course, we've said that a couple of times already, but vulnerability isn't good or bad. It's not a black or white subject. It just is a part of life. And I always thought, for a long time that being vulnerable was weakness, right? You're talking about like your insecurities or your shame or, whatever that feeling is, your fears. And I just always thought that like I needed to have this facade or persona, like I know what I'm doing. I know what, I'm an expert in all the things. And it really did strip my joy, which is why Evolve is all about drop the facade of perfection, because you're stripping yourself of joy if you're trying to be perfect at everything. So 2, she says, allowing yourself to actually be vulnerable is a sign of strength and courage. It's a lot easier to avoid the things that might make you vulnerable rather than to lean into them. But it also means that you're missing out on a lot of the good things, right? The joy and the love and the acceptance of being who you really are. So she talks about being loved. And if you've ever been loved before, you would allow someone into your heart and you give them incredible power. And I have to tell you, after being divorced and all this stuff, and going through an abusive relationship, it took me a while, my poor husband, it took me a while to really lean into that vulnerability and give him that power, because I had given it away before and been completely crushed by it. So, but then during that time too, I was not fully living in joy and peace and harmony either. And so I've learned over the years, like the more vulnerable I can be, and I'm just going to use my husband in this instance because most of us have one, then I am more tapped into the joy and love and acceptance. So it means vulnerability isn't just the source of pain and grief, but it's also the root of many of those positive emotions. And so the more we can get vulnerable, the more we allow those positive emotions to come into our lives as well. So number 2, build a resilience to shame by understanding it and saying it out loud. So when I was in therapy, I had a lot of past traumas that I decided I needed to work through. And one of the things that she told me was that you need to say it out loud. So shame lives in darkness. It's like a mold, right? The more you shut it out, the more you pretend it's not there, the more it grows. And so if you just bring it to the light and speak it out into existence, I can't even tell you all the things that I just spoke out and then it was gone. Like, okay, that happened, but now it's over and it's gone. So she says, what's worse than completely bombing a speaking gig? It's being ashamed about bombing a speaking gig and never doing one again. So there's a quote that says, failure is temporary, giving up is what makes it permanent. Right? So shame is what makes you want to give up. Like, I'm so shameful. I spoke way too long. I was an MC at this chamber event. I'm laughing now just thinking about it. And I'm rambling on because in the notes, she didn't give me updated notes. So there was like no end piece or whatever. So I'm like trying to end this thing and I'm not sure where the baskets are and all this stuff. And so she comes up on stage and basically like pushes me away from the podium and ends the event. And that sat with me for a long time. You can tell it's still I'm embarrassed about it, but that sat with me for a long time. But when I was able to just say, hey, you know what, that happened. It was an experience. Next time I'm going to ask for the notes ahead of time. And then it won't have, hopefully that same thing won't happen again. But that shame, if I had let that fester and never emceed another event at a chamber event or never went out and spoke again, that's really that shame is just festering and I'm missing out on the joy that I really get when I go out and speak. So she says, pinpointing what actually makes you feel ashamed and saying it out loud brings it to the light and takes a lot of that power of shame away. So if there's something that you're thinking about, something that was shameful or something that is, you're afraid of talking about or, whatever it is, I highly recommend that you find a trusted friend, or if that's your husband or your mom or whatever, and just get it out and just talk about it and let it go. So, okay, that's not in my notes, but all right. So, whoops, happens every time. Lesson 3. Okay, be a role model for your future kids. Or for your kids, your current kids, if there's no future kids. It's the only way they learn. So she is a big advocate for parenting and taking all of the things that you're learning and really pouring that into your children. I think that any of these tips here that she talks about children can be also poured into your team, right? So instead of, she says, it's your job to really make your home and family a shame-free zone, right? It's the only way your kids are going to grow up feeling worthy and loved and able to truly accept and be themselves. So she says, instead of talking about values like honesty and courage and ambition and talking about these things, like live them, right? Live in honesty, live in courage, live in ambition. Let them see your work ethic. Let them see that you are afraid, but you're still doing it afraid, right? And be open and vulnerable with your children as well. So she said the best thing that you can do for your kids is to be a role model. She says it's all the parenting you need. I would love to tap into more of that because I feel like there's a lot more that goes into it, but maybe we're all just making it more difficult than it needs to be. But anyway, so I think, again, that these things, instead of talking about, and we've talked about leadership in this group a lot, and doing the hard things and going down and picking up, brass we talked about in leadership strategy, and not leaving that to the people who are under you. So if you're not out doing the things that you expect your people to be doing, or your the people underneath you to be doing, then of course you're not making as big of an impact and that you could be. So those are our 3 lessons from this book. Again, I said this before I started recording. This book is chock full of stuff, you guys. It's very difficult to pull out 3 things from anything Brene Brown writes. So I highly recommend you getting this book, the Daring Greatly book, and then also the one we did a couple of weeks ago, The Gifts of Imperfection. There's 10 of those guideposts. So I just highly recommend adding those to your library. Okay, so let's go into the last part. Okay, so she says the main points: vulnerability is both at the core of difficult emotions like fear, grief, and disappointment, but it's also the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, empathy, innovation, and creativity. So the more we can be vulnerable, the more we tap into that creative side of ourselves. So 3 points: garner the courage to be yourself in a world full of fakes. Learn to live more joy and less fear, and learn to be vulnerable to become stronger. So I hope that resonated with you. These are going to be our breakout questions. If you're watching this on the replay, I recommend that you kind of look through these and see if any of these resonate with you, maybe journal about them. She says, over time, people regret what they didn't do more than what they did do. Regrets of inaction are far more common than regrets of action. So get all that shame out and then go make some stuff happen. So here's our breakout questions. 1, how do you handle shame when you felt that you have failed? Do you find vulnerability is easy for you? Why and why not? And then how do you really feel about vulnerability? Like, how do you really feel about vulnerability? Is this a scary thing for you? Is it like, oh, I'm vulnerable all the time, I'm just me, I'll just, throw it out to the wind? And if you are that kind of person, I'd love to chat. But do you find you grow more when you're vulnerable? And then number 3, what do you think you could do to improve your level of courage in the vulnerability space? And do you feel that you show up vulnerably in most situations, or do you tend to stay guarded? Why and why not? So I hope that you found some great tips out of this book, and we will see you next time.